Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to the fifth of the 2012 Gifford Lectures, given by Professor Sarah Coakley of the University of Cambridge. Professor Coakley has taught at Lancaster, Oxford, Harvard, before taking up her chair in Cambridge. As those of you who've been to earlier lectures will know, Professor Coakley is not following the trade winds. These are very engaging, thought-provoking lectures, and from the handout for tonight's talk, I think this tradition will be continued. Tonight's lecture is Teleology Revisited, a new ethno-teleological argument for God's existence, and I'll hand over to Professor Coakley.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you. In the last two lectures in this Gifford series, I shall be regathering the various and complex strands from my first four lectures on evolutionary cooperation in order to mount a new ethico-teleological rendition of natural theology for today, one that I trust would still garner Adam Gifford's approval in some measure, although not at all in the mode that he in his own age entertained. In order to undertake this task clearly, I want first, in this somewhat extended introductory section tonight, to provide you with a very succinct recapitulation and reclarification of the different levels at which I have been reflecting so far in these lectures on evolutionary cooperation and altruism, and to provide a foretaste of the final level on which my argument today will climax. In the rest of tonight's lecture, I shall then be leading you through the stages of the proposed new argument for God's existence, which flows directly out of the materials we have been surveying and forms their philosophical and theological completion. Note that I say materials here rather than evidences, because from the very outset of these lectures, I have resisted the characteristically modernist idea that we have a flat plane of uncontentious evidences to stand on in this undertaking. Any progress we have already made in our task, then, has involved entering into philosophical contention about the disputed current meanings of mathematical and empirical accounts of evolution. And I have continued to hold fast to my theological promise at the outset that whilst I would strategically dispossess myself to the search for truth in this field, I would guard against any naively correlationist idea that the latest deliverances from evolutionary biology would somehow disclose instant theological conclusions. The task we are engaged in here involves many interleaved layers of decision in evolutionary theory, philosophy of biology, and metaphysics, as we shall discover again today. I left you last time, you'll recall, with the insights of the 4th century Cappadocian fathers on what we might call their new visionary moment in cultural evolution about altruism and asceticism and their mutual relation. The further theological materials I shall regather into my basket today from the 13th and 18th centuries, respectively, are again not idly chosen. They represent key moments of philosophical and theological transition in the Christian heritage of human thinking about altruism and its relation to the natural world, which are in turn, of course, primarily indebted behind that to the assumed authority of the biblical canon. Within these two last lectures, then, it will begin to become clear how I perceive such authority appropriately to operate in a delicate conversation such as this has been between contemporary science, philosophy, and theology. Such authority is neither imposed dogmatically from the outset, nor yet added as a mere optional veneer of preferential interpretation to supposedly uncontentious scientific facts. It is more truly the case, as we shall see today and in the last lecture, that the discourses of evolution and theology have always been, and probably always will be, profoundly entangled. Yet we make a fundamental mistake if we try to insert from outside a story of divine operations into the mix as if somehow in competition with evolutionary events. That is a matter for careful metaphysical clarification, which will follow. A quick review of our discussion up till now of the significance of recent findings about evolutionary cooperation will provide us with the following lessons. First, when we consider the way that mathematical accounts of the structures of cooperation have clarified the recurrent patterns and dilemmas of evolutionary processes, from the bacterial level on upwards, we cannot but acknowledge their achievements in putting paid to the wholly random account of evolution, which might seem to consign us metaphysically to a form of pessimistic fatalism. At the very least, what these mathematical accounts have shown is that cooperation is present in consistent patterned forms throughout the evolutionary spectrum, and that without its subtle sustaining presence, evolutionary populations inexorably decline. That is itself a very significant explanatory achievement on the part of mathematicalized evolutionary theory. It bespeaks, as I have put it more than once before, a generative feature even in costly evolutionary behaviors. This same mathematics, now newly contentious because of the debates about inclusive fitness, and thus about how to explain thoroughgoingly sacrificial behaviors in some insects as bees, can nonetheless be supplemented, as we've seen in recent lectures, with insights from empirical biology about the intensification of cooperation through its creative intersection with sexual selection and its conjoining with seemingly intentional forms of cooperation in dolphins and the affective inputs of other higher mammals. The evolutionary transition to the human world, however, is fraught with philosophical and moral danger. For the first time now, the picture of defection and cooperation cannot be reductively or fully accounted for mathematically, precisely because free human intentionality, however it may be explained in terms of philosophy of mind, is involved in all its moral ambiguity and new power beyond the merely animal, whether for destructive and violent purposes, even in the false name of sacrifice, or for its opposite. When we then meet human altruistic behavior of the most spontaneous and, as I put it, excessive form, as in the case of Wes Autry in the New York subway, we recall, we wonder at what we might call its supernormal quality, as such types of action have been characterized by the philosopher Alexander Pruss. Is this a freakish one-off event, we wonder, or some kind of intimation of what would be more extensively possible if there were the appropriate frameworks of ethical formation, habit, and practice? We see here that this kind of strategic, utilitarian understanding of cooperation and altruism, such as game theory tends to assume, has reached either its denouement or its fulfillment. We are forced to decide at this point, as we reflected in Lecture 3 last week, whether a different meta-ethic from the utilitarian, especially some kind of Kantian deontology or neo-Aristotelian perspective, doesn't more effectively account for cooperation and altruistic manifestations in the longer run. We now move to consider what intentional, institutionalized forms of ascetical altruism, as for instance in Christian monasticism, might show us about such purportedly supernormal undertakings. Monasticism can, of course, go badly wrong when its moral compass is awry, to be sure, but it has subtle and profound dimensions involving sets of practices for arriving at agreement, especially in an emergency, on how to carry out conjoined altruism of an excessive nature. The rule of St. Benedict, in particular, is insistent on specific, well-honed ways of arriving at consensus in community, without any inappropriately imposed authority from the superior, and on the assumption of a vow of stabilitas, to stay where one is in community at all costs. In the case of the Cistercian monks of Tiberine and the Atlas Mountains in Algeria in 1966, during the chaos of the Algerian Civil War, these processes resulted, as we saw in the film Des Hommes et des Dieux on Sunday, in the decision to stay in their community and in faithful support of their Muslim village neighbors, whom they had protected and nurtured, even while knowing that this would most likely lead to political harassment, capture, and death, which it eventually did. By way of indicating here at the beginning of this lecture, then, where it is finally tending, let me show you now this short emblematic interlude from the film, which in a way constitutes its theological climax and indicates what flavour of intentionality was at stake in the monks' decision not to flee the political violence around them. In this cut, Brother Christoph, who has been struggling with huge agony about the decision to stay in Tiberine, is being encouraged by his superior, Dom Christian de Chergé, not to consider it as madness, which it will certainly seem to the world, nor yet as heroics, nor as a manipulative attempt to gain fame as a martyr, a fate which Christian says should be avoided right up to the end. Rather, it is a matter of fidelity and love, both to the Cistercian community itself and to their Muslim villager friends, wrought out of the death already undertaken when one becomes a monk, leaving all possibilities of genetic inheritance and family comforts behind in the first place. Thus, one altruistic death suggests another, and that without fear. This is, however, an altruistic excess, we might say, a supernormal ethical manifestation motivated and sustained from the monk's perspective only by transcendent Christological forces and by belief in a hope beyond physical death. The question that now presses, it seems to me, when we see such actual supernormal variants on human altruism is this. Should we explain, in some sense of that difficult term, such phenomena as mere meaningless spandrels of cultural evolution, delusions, in fact, which are thereby guaranteed no future cultural impact or significance? Or should we adjudicate the given meanings with the phenomena as outcomes of cooperative grace? Should we, in other words, take seriously suggestion that excessive, non-genetic cultural altruism can be called forth by transcendent forces and can indeed itself constitute an argument for God's existence? To begin to answer this question, we need to go back to the evolutionary baseline once more and to inquire how teleology actually fares and functions, if at all, in the intricate processes of pre-human mutation, selection, and cooperation. Only then can we come back to the human level and inquire what is happening when purposive altruism occurs in apparently extreme forms. We recall that Darwin himself remained excessively ambivalent, at least in patches throughout his career, about this very topic of teleology. Yet the way his imagination was captivated in his student days by Paley's natural theology indicates, as we've mentioned in an earlier lecture, the fascination evolutionary purposiveness held for him. And this interest and attendant language clearly sustains and even actively animates significant portions of Origins of Species. Yet equally certainly, by the end of Darwin's life, this belief was faltering. It is reliably reported, for instance, that in a conversation with a friend in 1885, Darwin was invited to agree that simply looking on, quote, wonderful contrivances for certain purposes in nature convinced one that they must be expressions of mind. To which Darwin memorably replied, well, that often comes over me with overwhelming force, but at other times it just seems to go away, close quote. The problem here, as still is the case in most contemporary debates in this area, is that teleology has become a word now inherently tainted by appeals to an extrinsic, interventionist form of theological explanation. Admittedly, Paley himself has been much maligned too, as well as claimed for their courses by such weirdly contrasting parties as the intelligent design proponents on the one hand and Dawkins on the other. And thus he himself deserves at least a slightly more sympathetic reading than he often now receives. As John Brooke shows in a recent essay, Paley actually neither pretends to provide a deductive argument for God's existence, as such, he's often thought to do that, nor does he disconnect his natural theology from his writings about biblical revelation and ethics, as is often charged. On the contrary, He presents them as a systematic package. But underlyingly, there is a deeper problem, and the one that Darwin's theological thinking latterly founded on. For the God Paley argues to, via the well-known image of the watch, is an extrinsic divine designer who implicitly inhabits the same time and space spectrum as the creation itself, and thus, as it were, competes for space within it. This is nothing like, therefore, the earlier scholastic divine being found in Thomas's theology, atemporal, possessed of all omniperfections to an eminent degree, and utterly ontologically distinct, qua creator out of nothing. As Simon Oliver convincingly argues in a recent paper, the particularly modern problem of divine teleology is thus that the notion has shrunk from about the time of Francis Bacon on to a mechanistic account of efficient causation, and has abandoned the distinctly Aristotelian and Thomist understanding of final causation as inherently linked to it. No wonder then that Darwin himself towards the end of his life, and most secular biologists to this day, see teleology as a notion to be avoided. It smacks of an unnecessary divine pseudo-explanatory hypothesis, which is likely to crash into and compete with the workings of evolution itself. It is best, therefore, I believe, to expel this particular modernistic ghost from the scene ourselves before proceeding to a more nuanced account of how the idea of teleology may still nonetheless be functioning importantly at various levels in the evolutionary spectrum. Let us now try to get clear about this. The first level of legitimate teleological reflection within the study of evolution is simply that of biologists' everyday talk. To be sure, working biologists tend, under the influence of Ernst Mayr, to prefer the term teleonomy rather than teleology for this area of discussion, precisely in order to see off that misleading theological association of the older word, and to constrain their investigations towards non-agential understandings. But the more honest amongst them will admit that questions like, what is this beak for? Or rather differently, why has this form of behavior come about in, say, ants or meerkats? Or, differently again, what is it to be a spoonbill? Are not only legitimate in evolutionary investigation, but ultimately scientifically unavoidable. To be sure, the standard functionalist riposte to a philosophical inquiry about what this language is actually doing will still be that it is merely rhetorical or metaphorical in a rather misleading sense of that latter term. It will be explained, for instance, that it is nothing but loose and slightly misleading shorthand for goings-on that are entirely purposeless inherently, but need nonetheless to be explained to non-specialists like me in ways suitable to our poorer understanding of the matter. But recall again from Lecture 3 our discussion of neo-Aristotelian and Thomist accounts of biological teleology as handled by Jean Porter in her recently enunciated natural law theory. Citing appreciatively the work of James Lennox on Aristotle's conception of teleology, she mounts a very strong case against the reductive functionalism of the kind of evolutionary biology which is solely interested in random genetic transmissions. Were this the only story that evolution could deliver, she says, it would indeed have little to contribute to a natural law theory of the sort she is after. But it would also have little to contribute in many other cases of necessary biological investigation. The main point here, well brought out too by Lenny Moss in his book What Genes Can't Do, is that this account of evolution and its manifestations is extraordinarily thin, and thus gives, as we have repeatedly stressed, a very partial account of the richness of multi-leveled stories in the evolutionary spectrum. In effect, if it really eschews all teleology, it just says that what happens, happens. Moreover, as Porter puts it in Nature as Reason, page 94, quote, if we could account for the operations of living creatures at the level merely of genetic interactions, we would never even need to refer to the kind of creature in question in formulating a causal explanation for its operations. close quote. What she is after here, of course, is a concept of natural kind, also often considered to be somewhat outmoded, in which fact and value strongly cohere. What is it to have a certain sort of beak, or slightly differently, to be a spoonbill, is to have certain goal-directed features of life written into the equation, goals which are precisely the ones in which the species spoonbill can indeed flourish. By now, the well-institutionalized functionalists amongst you may be shaking your heads in horror. Whence comes this language of flourishing? Is it another arbitrary imposition on merely random and meaningless factual occurrences? The answer, of course, is that the language of imposition here begs the very question that this neo-Aristotelian approach sets out to resolve. If it is meaningful, indeed explanatorily necessary, to engage the notion of flourishing in order to answer certain questions that biologists can and do regularly ask, then surely the proof is in the pudding. If, for instance, I need to know why it is that lions in a certain game park are stressed, a seemingly innocuous and widely used description for animals under threat, my question will, of course, itself implicitly bring with it the notion of the opposite, of normative flourishing in environmental conditions rather different than the ones that currently obtain. It should also be added, as I've hinted more than once before, that while the evolutionary phenomenon of cooperation can indeed be analysed purely in stochastic mathematical terms, the wider philosophical issues it raises also demand of us some account of what, in turn, it is for, that is, what its explanatory significance is again for the flourishing of particular species or groups. As I mentioned at the end of Lecture 2, Novak himself is currently in some philosophical uncertainty about where he stands on this problem. His Harvard program he has named Evolutionary Dynamics, not Evolutionary Stochastic, and this expresses, I think, his philosophical indecision. Technically speaking, then, he should be challenging some of his more reductively inclined Harvard colleagues to a deeper philosophical debate about the way that he, unlike many economic game theorists or genetic determinists, is implicitly giving normative value to certain forms of cooperation and human altruism. The fact is, as my Cambridge colleague Tim Lewins has exposed in a number of illuminating survey articles, and he is no Aristotelian himself, indeed much more inclined to the Kantian notion of theoretical rejection, it is virtually impossible to expunge altogether the notion of teleology, either from any general account of evolutionary functions, or more particularly, from any close philosophical account of evolutionary adaptation. For when you come to think about it, adaptation too implies a normative state of affairs, the resolution of an evolutionary dilemma to that which benefits the species. As Mark Badow, another defender of biological teleology, sums up the matter, analysing the similarly normative role of a heart's pumping, I quote, "Teleology involves not merely effects that tend to bring about their own production," that is the alternative tautological or circular account of the heart's function, "but good effects that tend to bring about their own production." So to talk about the heart's pumping is already implicitly too to make a normative set of ideas put forward. As Alistair MacIntyre puts it elsewhere, we simply cannot avoid asking what is good for an individual, group, or species when we start to think and question deeply about what is going on in evolution. It would seem then that teleology is impossible completely to expunge from evolutionary biological analysis, despite remainingly strong rhetorical claims to the contrary by those inoculated against the very word teleology, and more particularly inoculated against the extrinsic or mechanistic theological rendition of the word that I too resist. It may well be then, as both Michael Ruse and Tim Lewins argue, that the history of evolution and of teleological thinking, originally natural theological thinking, are so completely entangled as to be inseparable. Now this makes it all the more interesting that at a slightly different level of discussion than that already analysed up till now, teleology has also seemingly reappeared on the theoretic horizon of late in the rather different and seemingly ontological category of successive evolutionary transitions. Let me briefly explain the importance of this hypothesis, which comes from the late John Maynard Smith in collaboration with his colleague Eös Satmati. Maynard Smith hypothesized towards the end of his long and productive professional life, in which he had contributed significantly to the mathematical study of cooperation, that we can and should identify particularly important moments of transition in the history of evolution, from individually replicating molecules to chromosomes, from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction, from single-celled to multicellular organisms, and from individuals to social groups. Moreover, in a sense as yet not fully explicated mathematically, but nonetheless intuitively convincing, each of these moments of transition seems to require a phase of important stability in evolutionary cooperation to allow it to take place. So once we look at evolutionary history according to this progressivist account, with these important breakthrough moments preceded in each case by an evolutionarily stable form of cooperation developing, and once we have an understanding of the productive significance of cooperation for these breakthroughs, more than one remarkable conclusion seems to follow. First, we have again been released from a story of random meaninglessness, and specifically by means of the fruitful application of mathematical thinking to evolution. And thus we regain a structured and even teleological account of the whole of evolution. Secondly, this approach would seem to parallel, though by means of different forms of analysis, Simon Conway Morris's paleontological account of convergence in his celebrated book, Life's Solution. That is, the account comes with a strong conviction that these stages of progressive development in evolution would reoccur in some similar form if, in Stephen Jay Gould's terms, the evolutionary tape were ever to be replayed. Third, then, we gain a perspective on evolution in which, as in the deeply unfashionable now thought of Michael Polanyi, there is some sort of what he called irreducible structure to evolutionary life. So at two levels, I'm arguing, teleology is indispensable to evolutionary thinking. This is still contentious material. It's not just at the level of having to use this language in order to do our business as biologists, but it's also at the level of this larger narrative of ascending breakthroughs in which cooperation plays a significant role. Now, I hope by now I've convinced you, at least in part, of the scientific and philosophical fruitfulness of the application of teleological ideas, still of an entirely pre-theological sort, note, to pre-human evolutionary processes. In so doing, I've laid the groundwork for my second major move in tonight's lecture, to provide a fresh assessment of how the supposedly failed teleological arguments for God's existence in the work of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century and of Immanuel Kant in the 18th, now look, in the light of these new evolutionary deliverances, and especially in the light of their contemporary mathematicalization, worthy of fresh reflection. Because of the brevity of the time I have available to me, I shall perforce have to proceed with some bold strokes. However, where I'm going you already know. At the end of this reassessment, we shall turn to what I have called the supernormal ethical behaviors of the saints, and see what we might be able to conclude from them, not as evidences as such, but as manifestations which demand from us some sort of response, both rational and affective. But in order to go there, we first have to do something a bit new with both the Aristotelian and the Kantian heritage. We have to put their insights into teleology together with their insights about normative ethics, since this intersection is clearly where our investigation of evolutionary cooperation and altruism has taken us. The fresh combination will, I believe, prove revealing and powerful in itself, though still in need of supplement by my last move. The short version then of my argument here is this. I shall move in backward chronology and start with Kant, because I want to show how his own particular version of scientific metaphysics lands him in a dilemma about teleology, which he can never himself fully resolve within the epistemological limits that his critical philosophy has set. He comes agonizingly close to resolving the dilemma, even at the end of his career, but the dots can never be joined metaphysically. Then, in hindsight and in comparison, we can see how a revised neo-Aristotelian Thomism can solve this particular issue better, though not without new difficulties arising in another area, that of the teleological argument for God as such. It will be clear that Kant was fascinated with what he later came to call the physico-theological argument all his life. I want to express my indebtedness to one of my doctoral students, James Orr, who's working in this area for what comes now. In Kant's pre-critical period, God is for Kant still implicitly knowable through the evidences of order and beauty in the natural world. But he resists what he sees as crasser teleological arguments on offer at the time for their appeal to specific, extrinsic divine interventions and a kind of teleological tinkering. At the same time, he's fully aware of the critical Humean riposte that the order seen in the world could be not from any God as such, but simply the result of nature being, as he puts it, sufficient to herself. Already then, he attempts to steer between a sporadic interventionalism and an altogether unnecessary hypothesis. Yet his devotion to the idea of a so-called most high being, or a divine author, constantly shines through his earlier writings. In the first critique, in contrast, as is well known, Kant returns to what he regards as the three main arguments for God's existence, the ontological, the cosmological, and what he calls the physico-theological. And he now declares the arguments unworkable, or what he calls impossible. The reason for this shift is underlyingly inevitable, given Kant's new critical epistemology in the first critique, combined with his controversial transcendental idealism. We cannot claim, he says, scientific knowledge of what is beyond the limits of what we can cognize empirically under the conditions of the mind's transcendental deduction of categories. And hence, simply by definition, God being not one more entity in the world, of this Kant is much clearer than many of his contemporaries, is outside those Grenzen, those limits, and must perforce therefore become a postulate of practical reason instead, the as-if which provides the eschatological guarantee of the moral law. Thus, as he puts it, the only theology of reason which is possible is that which is based upon moral laws or seeks guidance for them. As is often remarked, however, Kant continues to show great respect for the physico-theological proof, which, as he puts it, always deserves to be mentioned with respect. I quote, "It is the oldest, the clearest, and the most accordant with the common reason of mankind. It enlivens the study of nature, just as it itself derives its existence and gains ever new vigor from that source. It suggests ends and purposes where our observation would not have detected them by themselves, and extends our knowledge of nature by means of the guiding concept of a special unity, the principle of which is outside nature." Remarkable that he can still write that. It has always struck me that some of this last sentence should not really have been written by the philosopher, who has just told us repeatedly that we cannot by definition know anything about what lies outside the realm of the empirical observable world. A bit later, moreover, Kant will say that while the, quote, objective reality of the supreme being cannot be proved, it cannot be disproved either. And this seemingly leaves it in an ambiguous position as always reached for by a reason that, according to Kant, inexorably tends to stretch beyond its appropriate limits. Whilst then this wise author of nature, as he still calls it, has ostensibly in the first critique been sent off duty altogether and replaced by the mere postulate of practical reason, we can detect a strange and interesting relation between the two lines of approach. The moral regulative principle is now doing the heavy philosophical lifting, to be sure, but the old God of ultimate teleological purpose somehow still hangs around apophatically in the background. It is an uneasy solution, and Kant is well aware of it, it seems. It is why he keeps returning to the problem and comes back yet again in the later third critique in his extended discussion of teleological judgment. Once again, however, the dots cannot finally be joined between a theology of nature and a properly moral theology, even despite everything Kant says here about, quote, the great finality in the world, which compels us to conceive that there is a supreme cause of this finality, and one whose causality has an intelligence behind it. So he's still playing with this idea. But this, he immediately adds, I quote, in no way entitles us to ascribe such intelligence to that cause. We can only ever go as far as the as if and let the moral argument do the rest. Yet, in the very last paragraph of the Critique of Judgment, Kant will acknowledge that this strangely limbo land type physico-teleological theology can at least serve as what he calls a propaedeutic to theology proper, since by means of the study of physical ends, he says, it awakens us to the idea of a final end which nature cannot exhibit. What is so fascinating here, of course, is that something in Kant is still clearly yearning to bring back the teleological argument. And so he does, in some measure, since it can at the last take one as far as being this first stage propaedeutic to a properly moral decision for God. Whilst Kant cannot finally objectify this teleological God, and his reasons are at least as much spiritual as epistemological, remember he is the first to name the problem of ontotheology that was to be taken up by Heidegger. It would be hard to say that the teleological argument isn't still doing some work in bringing the would-be believer to an affective and rational decision in terms of practical reason. Perhaps it will be freshly clear now why I find this rereading of the Kantian problematic of the relation between the moral argument and the physico-teleological so intriguing in the light of contemporary evolutionary evidences about cooperation and altruism. Whilst the evolutionary world, seen through the lens of this new mathematical calculus, is pervasively shot through with cooperative teleology, this can, on Kant's view, serve as a propaedeutic to the rational moral decision which finally has to be made for God, and to involve thereby properly motivated altruism. So reflection on teleology in the natural world can take you so far, and then in comes the moral argument which has to supervene. John Hare, in his adjusted Kantian argument for the necessity of a moral order, would, I think, then help to clarify the Kantian position further as involving aiming at what he calls the actuality of the highest good in the sense of a necessary conjoining of individual virtue and happiness, and the further possibility of an even higher good in which all are acting in accordance with the moral law and thus are happy too. But how does all this compare with the possible new Thomist rendition of teleology in relation to virtue, as suggested by the evolutionary evidences we have early been considering? Again, we have a slightly complicated picture. For while on the one hand, as we saw in Lecture 3, Thomas's account of natural law can, unlike Kant's moral theory, seamlessly move from its intrinsic normativeness in the world of biology to its more ramified but equally intrinsic normativeness in the area of virtue, thus avoiding the problematic gap that attends Kant's attempts to conjoin teleology and morality. The connection of both of these dimensions of Thomas's thought to his so-called teleological argument, the fifth way in the 5 ways at the beginning of the Summa, is much more problematic. And here, in turn, Thomas does not join all the dots that we might like him to, nor does his argument convince in its existing form. Now, I happen not to share the now widespread view that Thomas did not intend probatively to convince people of God's existence at all by the use of his 5 ways, but rather merely to evoke a sense of mystery or something. That's quite a common position now. It seems to me rather, following Nicholas Wolterstorff's rich article on this point that I put on your handout, that whilst Aquinas most certainly is not doing modern Lockean evidentialism in either the Summa Contra Gentiles or the Summa Theologiae, any more than I am doing it in this project, he shows signs of using his arguments for God for different purposes at different times. Sometimes, as Wolterstorff puts it, to convince a non-believer, conversing with a believer. Sometimes to bolster the revelatory belief of an existing believer who doesn't understand fully the revelation involved. And sometimes to help transmute into sight what a believer only already believes less than consciously. Thus a certain ambiguity hangs over what the 5 ways in the Prima Pars 1, question 2, art 3 are exactly intended to achieve. But I certainly don't think it's nothing or something completely circular, as some people argue. The main problem often now raised with the 5th way, the teleological, is that it ostensibly coheres very poorly with contemporary evolutionary theory. The argument of the 5th way, you will recall, appeals to the existence of order and apparent purpose in the universe and argues that the best explanation of this order is that the natural world was designed by a goal-directed intelligent being. Most contemporary commentators who still want to use this argument, for instance, the late lamented Norris Clarke in his programmatic essay on the continuing viability of natural theology, thus say that it now needs to be adjusted to allow it to accommodate what he calls the randomness of evolutionary development. My own view, however, as you might expect, veers in an opposite direction. That is, I take it as a grave mistake to smuggle back into the argument any trace of the extrinsic God competing for space, such as Thomas in any case abhors, and as might be suggested here. And I also do not think, in the light of the evolutionary patternings illuminated by game theory, that we need to worry too much about the randomness issue. What we do need to worry about, however, is that I can see no reason why the agnostic or skeptic could not simply stop at the evidences of evolutionary order kindly supplied by game theory and merely now attribute it to the evolutionary processes themselves. So out of our brief discussion of Kant and Thomas, respectively, we have 2 different remaining sorts of problems. While Kant artfully but somewhat uncomfortably combines an appeal to teleological regularity as a mere propedeutic to a moral decision, and backs away from locating teleology finally in the world in itself, Thomas, on the other hand, supplies a natural law ethic which seemingly coheres perfectly with the deliverances of evolutionary cooperation and altruism, but cannot supply an effective teleological argument for God's existence, which doesn't simply repose back to the observation of the evolutionary world's own order. We come then to the promised final denouement, one in which the ecstatic or excessive altruism of the saints, such as Timothy Jackson in Lecture 3 charged should never be explained in evolutionary form, becomes the suggestive mode of reflection for what has seemingly passed beyond mere cultural evolution and become a manifestation of response to a transcendent realm of grace, or what I've called supernormality. Please do note here that I do not wish this move to be seen in any sense as a last gasp of the extrinsic God of the gaps, nor, as I've endlessly repeated, as a Lockean evidentialist move. Indeed, when and if such manifestations of supernormality become the means of a productive reflection on the category of grace, there is no intention whatever that grace then be seen as restricted to such events. On the contrary, the veil may then be lifted on a much deeper and wider perception of the operations of grace in the world as a whole, both pre-human and human. What I'm after here, then, is what Alexander Pruss has put it so beautifully thus, I quote, "Let us suppose," he says, and I've argued this too at some length today, that evolution delivers normative facts, including the normative generativeness of cooperation and altruism in sustaining pre-human and human groups in what we've called flourishing. But then how do we account for supernormative acts, acts which go well beyond what is needed for mere flourishing, and indeed may result in some instances in death or profound suffering as a result of this supernormativity. We need, as Pruss puts it, I quote, a cause capable of generating new irreducible facts that do not simply derive from old ones. God would be such a cause. But note, he goes on immediately, that this argument differs profoundly from the God of the gaps arguments, like those of Paley or the ID people, in which positing a designer offers an explanation of something science currently can't explain. Because the present argument offers an explanation of a fact that, for principled reason, science as such cannot ever possibly explain. Consider in this regard, Pruss goes on, Jean Vanier, or Mother Teresa, whose excessive altruism made it difficult to say in any obvious sense that they are gaining any fitness advantage, whether genetic or cultural, in doing what they do or did. Or consider Bonhoeffer, whose fitness disadvantage was precisely to die and never have any children. Such people's lives, as to the lives and deaths of the Tiberine monks, are in one sense, quote, known spiritually by their fruits, close quote. But the central epistemological issue is that we somehow cannot appropriately say that their altruism is abnormal. Rather, it is supernormal in a sense only to be derived, in a Christian context, from imitating what Luther called the proper man and his example. This so-called natural theology argument, then, is a new kind of natural theology argument. It's a profoundly Christological one at base. It seems impossible for us to account for these behaviors in any other way, however, and however beautifully they are prefigured in the ordering of evolutionary cooperation and altruism through the natural world. And so my case rests. We have come a long way today in reviewing how certain classical arguments for God, both teleological and moral, do have continuing force and interest in the light of the new understanding of evolutionary cooperation and altruism. We have insisted on the new explanatory force and efficacy of neo-Aristotelian accounts of biological processes, and we have reiterated our conviction that both Thomist and Kantian metaethics cohere in significant explanatory ways with the new deliverances from mathematical evolutionary theory. Cohere more illuminatingly, in fact, than does the consequentialism or emotivism that may more often be invoked by evolutionary psychologists or economic game theorists. Along the way, though, we've been haunted by what Pruss was the first to term the supernormal coming out of evolutionary life. And in this last move this evening, I've made my first statement of what its status as an argument for God's existence might be. If I have left you puzzling about what sort of explanatory force such a theological argument might be said to have, or how it should appropriately be responded to, noetically, affectively, or spiritually, that is because I leave to my last and final lecture on Thursday the account of what sort of natural theology is appropriate and viable for today in the light of evolutionary deliverances, and what work I want to do with that, theologically and spiritually. Indeed, I shall be returning again to Gregory of Nyssa, because there is a piece of an argument here that needs to be put into place that I have not yet disclosed to you, and that is his extraordinarily interesting tradition of the spiritual senses, in which he argues that there is a form of seeing which can only be activated precisely by spiritual practice. To that final task, then, I turn my attention on Thursday evening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We do have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Extremely stimulating once again. Can I just ask about your proof from sainthood once more? I mean, formally speaking, of course, the way you described it as describing a reality that is inexplicable. Otherwise, formally speaking, is a clear parallel to the God of the gaps.
Appears to
And
be.
so the otherwise, what is otherwise, needs to be explained a little deeper. And I suppose if we look at the example of the Cistercian monks, it would seem that there is actually a possible explanation for it, but it would mean to declare them insane.
Which was
So
discussed
it's,
in the clip.
yeah, it's basically, you know, to declare them removed from reality in a way that concluded in a rather sort of crass moral judgment about them. A moral judgment that we, by instinct, tend to shy away from. We don't want to declare the monks, Theresa, Bonhoeffer, insane. And hence their giving of their lives, or whether to death or in terms of energy, null and void. And so I think in this sense, Kant was of course right. The evidence is one that can only be given in terms of practical reason, but I think there is a concept that is a traditional legal and theological concept that would help us conceptualize, and that is that of witness. A witness doesn't prove anything, but what he or she does in testifying to a reality is inviting a response. And the response that we have to give is, of course, a kind of moral response in terms of whether we sort of put our trust in the particular witness or not, as to whether there is a correspondence with reality that we, you know, sort of buy from the witness or not. And therefore, I find your suggestion to push Kant's important point of sort of the practical reasoning to be the decisive issue here a step further, and the proof from sainthood strikes me extremely interesting. It's of course not new, because the concept of witness has been thought through by, most recently, for example, by Stanley Hauerwas in a very parallel fashion. But that only sort of adds support to the move that you're making here, which I find really fascinating.
Thank you so much. That's extremely helpful. I agree. I'm on a knife edge about sounding God of the gappy, and that's why I named that, and I'm going to come back to it next time. But I think you can see there's a difference between saying, I've found something here that science can't explain for the moment, and saying, I've found something here that science will never explain, qua science. Do you see? That's an important distinction. Now, why is it that I'm happy to enrich this with the notion of witness, martyr, of course, theologically, but I don't want to move it away from the notion of an argument, of a philosophical argument. And I have a particular reason for that, because I think, as you know from these lectures as a whole, I consider it to be extraordinarily bad news for contemporary theology that it's given up on arguments for God, except in some notable counter-instances, and that the people who do make arguments for God, like Richard Swinburne, are doing it in a rather bizarre, probabilistic way, which is itself spiritually desiccating. So the idea that I can actually move this argument in at the apex of a very systematic, long set of reflections on the significance of evolutionary cooperation and altruism is a bit different from just saying, without going through all that procedure, well, I just go by the witnesses of the saints. Do you see what I mean? It's actually mounting a systematic case. So that's important to me. The other point I want to say is that, and this will feature largely in the last lecture, there are going to be certain features that I draw out in my last lecture of why this new natural theology isn't like any previous forms of natural theology, and yet isn't a retreat to mere perspectivalism. All right. And the first feature, which I've repeated endlessly, is that there is no flat plane on which scientists, philosophers, and theologians can do business as if that was uncomplicated. The second point, though, is precisely the one that you have now named, that the response to this argument has got to be not just a noetic or rational response, it's also got to be an affective response. It's got to be a life-changing response. And that's why I've kept Kant in play on precisely this point. This is where he's so interesting, that his moral argument is so closely allied to this remnant of the teleological argument that most people miss, that I think that confluence and his very deep understanding of the relationship between the rational and the affective here is really helpful for pulling that piece out. So thank you.
All sorts of wonderful stuff that you've taken apart and re-put together in very illuminating ways, and I've very much enjoyed it again. So I just want to probe, in part because you pressed us to, two moves that you made, which I'm not sure if I can buy them. The first one is a sort of biological one about the way you've talked about teleology. And perhaps this is only one of many ways to talk about teleology, but the reason why scientists resist that language is that is the problem of taxonomy, right? That lions are part of the cats, and Darwin's whole project was looking at the barnacles and the way that they don't fit into a Platonic ordering system, and so barnacles are just what you get when you get environmental conditions. So not only is teleological language, I mean, I think they mean it when they say teleology isn't really going on. It's just a lay language, and neither is the language of environmental stress on the lions meant, right? Because lions will become something later, or they will die out and be replaced by something else. And so it's to say that lions are stressed by the environment is equivalent conceptually to saying that rainbow is fading away, right? It's neither here nor there. The conditions are simply changing. So it's sort of riding on the coattails of some other empathetic, aesthetic values. So that taxonomic point makes it hard for me to understand where the teleology is that you're finding. The other point is much more straightforward because it's a theological point, and that the supernormal that you've been talking about sounds a lot like the old language of supererogation, and I'm curious if you'd clarify that.
Yes. I'm not, to start with that last one first, I'm not completely at ease with this supernormal language, but because this argument arose in our research group with Alex Pruss, I've kept it because I felt to steal his argument and then call it something different would be a bit naughty. Supererogation, yes, is applied in the arena of ethics to that which you do beyond that which you needed to do. And I suppose there is a certain parallel there. I'm more worried about it sounding a bit like the Übermensch in Nietzsche. So maybe excessive, or at one point I've used the language of ecstatic, would be a happier note. Now, I agree, I didn't mention the taxonomic problem, which is the major kickback, usually. And it raises all these big questions about natural kinds and whether they actually exist. And it's very interesting that Stephen could probably throw light on this, that, Quine's deflation of natural kinds is now being riposted belatedly by Hilary Putnam, who is strongly critical of that deflationary move. And like me, or rather I've been influenced by him, enormously committed now to overcoming the fact-value disjunction, which seems to have, as it were, messed up so many philosophical discussions in the 20th century. So I think there is a way round the specification problem, but it's a bit of a fudge, and it is that you have to take on board that, of course, you're dealing with a dynamic situation, all right? So there will be a period when you've got something with a spoon bill that's turning into something else, although that happens really very slowly. But I think it's not impossible to deal with that. I don't think it's an absolutely killer riposte. It's certainly a complication which needs to be dealt with. I was quite skeptical about this move to begin with. I became completely won over to the teleologists because I've been working so much with working biologists. And you know, the arguments, the things they're thinking about all the time are constantly, although they may not express it in this way, questions which are normative. I mean, they're dealing all the time with normative issues. I don't know how it is that they manage to pretend that they're not. It's one of the great mysteries of the philosophy of biology. And I'm delighted that Tim Lewins, who's my sort of favourite colleague in this area in Cambridge, I really commend his essays on functionalism and adaptation, because he goes through all the possible range of systematic options that you might be able to take up. I haven't looked at them all. And concludes that, you know, purposiveness of this sort is just inextricable from biological thinking. So we can pretend it isn't there, but I really ultimately don't think it